On a frozen morning in the mountains of Colorado, a police officer on routine patrol noticed something that made him stop the car and break protocol. A woman stood alone in a snow-covered cemetery, trying to bury her child in ground, so frozen it rang like stone. Beside her lay a small coffin, and no one else in the world to help her. What the officer did next, and the quiet loyalty of a German shepherd who refused to leave, would change 3 lives forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Durango, Colorado, sat quiet beneath a winter that refused to loosen its grip. Snow had fallen 3 nights in a row, not in dramatic blizzards, but in steady, punishing layers that buried sidewalks, muted sound, and narrowed the world to shades of white and gray. The Animas River moved slowly through the valley, its edges frozen thick, while the San Juan Mountains rose in the distance like watchful sentinels, their peaks sharp against a sky the color of old steel. Morning temperatures hovered well below freezing, the kind that burned lungs with every breath and made metal sting bare skin. Officer Ethan Mercer drove his patrol SUV along County Road 210 just after dawn, tires crunching over packed snow. At 45, Ethan carried himself with the rigid economy of someone who had spent most of his adult life in uniform. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his jacket, and a build that suggested strength earned through repetition rather than vanity. His face was angular, weathered by years of mountain sun and cold, with a short beard streaked faintly with gray that he kept trimmed more out of habit than style. His eyes, a pale, steady blue, rarely betrayed emotion, though people who knew him well said they missed nothing. Ethan had been with the Durango Police Department for nearly 20 years, most of them spent on night shifts and winter patrols. He spoke little, followed procedure meticulously, and treated everyone, drunks, tourists, grieving families, with the same measured calm. That composure hadn't come naturally. It had been carved into him years earlier, after a highway accident on Molas Pass took his wife Laura, while he was responding to another call. Since then, emotion had become something he managed, not something he indulged. In the back of the SUV, Rex lifted his head. Rex was a 7-year-old German shepherd, solidly built, with a black and tan coat dulled slightly by age and work. His muzzle was beginning to gray, and a thin scar ran just above his left eye, a souvenir from a search and rescue operation gone wrong years before. As a K9, Rex was disciplined, alert, and intensely loyal, trained to track missing persons and detect human scent even under snow. But there was something else about him that Ethan had come to trust more than any training manual. Rex noticed people before Ethan did, not threats. People. The dog's ears pricked forward now, his body going still. Ethan eased off the accelerator. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured, though he already knew Rex wouldn't answer. Rex never barked without reason. Instead, he let out a low sound in his throat, not a growl, more a warning edged with unease. Ethan followed Rex's gaze. Just beyond the tree line, at the edge of a small hillside cemetery most folks in Durango had forgotten about, stood a lone figure. The cemetery wasn't large, just a handful of weathered headstones, a few wooden crosses leaning under the weight of time, and a single narrow path barely visible beneath the snow. People hadn't buried their dead there in years, preferring the newer grounds closer to town. The figure was a woman. She stood beside a small, dark shape resting in the snow, her back bent slightly forward as if the cold itself had weight. In her hands was a shovel, its metal blade striking the frozen ground again and again, each impact sending up a dull, useless vibration. From this distance, Ethan could tell the effort was futile. The earth here had been frozen solid for weeks. Ethan pulled the SUV to the side of the road and shut off the engine. Silence pressed in, broken only by wind whispering through bare branches. Rex whined softly, already shifting, ready to move. Ethan opened the door, cold air rushing in, and clipped Rex's leash onto his harness. "Easy," he said, more to himself than the dog. This wasn't a call. There was no radio dispatch, no report, no protocol for a woman alone in a cemetery at dawn. But something about the scene felt wrong in a way paperwork couldn't fix. They walked slowly toward the cemetery, boots and paws crunching through snow. As they drew closer, details sharpened. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, slender but not fragile, her posture rigid with determination rather than weakness. She wore a heavy wool coat several sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a worn belt, and a knitted hat, pulled due over dark brown hair that escaped in loose strands around her face. Her skin was pale from cold and exhaustion, lips tinged faintly blue. She was tall, nearly Ethan's height, but carried herself as if trying to take up less space, shoulders pulled inward against the world. Beside her lay a child-sized coffin, simple and unadorned, made of rough pine boards. Snow had gathered along its edges, softening its shape, but there was no mistaking what it was. Ethan stopped a few yards away. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice steady, practiced. "Durango Police." The woman froze, shovel midair, then turned sharply. Her eyes were dark, wide, and rimmed red. Not from recent tears, Ethan noted, but from nights without sleep. She held the shovel like a weapon for half a second before recognition, or resignation, passed over her face. "I didn't call," she said. Her voice was hoarse, strained. "I'm not bothering anyone." "I know," Ethan replied. He kept his hands visible, posture open. "I was driving by." Her gaze flicked to Rex, who had sat down automatically beside Ethan, alert but calm. Something in her expression softened at the sight of the dog, just briefly, before hardening again. "What do you want?" she asked. Ethan took a breath. He recognized her now. "Marilyn Brooks," he said, not as an accusation, but a confirmation. She blinked. "Do I know you?" "Not really," he said. "You worked ER at Mercy Regional, a few years back." Understanding crossed her face, followed, quickly by something like distance. That was before. Before my son died, hung unspoken between them. Up close, Ethan could see the lines grief had etched into her features. Marilyn Brooks had been a nurse. He remembered that much. Known for her efficiency, her calm under pressure. Now that calm looked like something brittle, held together by sheer will. Her hands, gripping the shovel, were raw and reddened, knuckles cracked from cold. "I'm not doing anything illegal," she said quietly. "I just need some time." Ethan glanced at the ground she'd been trying to break, at the coffin. Procedure ran through his mind automatically. Permits, burial regulations, health codes. But none of it seemed to belong here. Rex stood and stepped forward, stopping just short of Marilyn. He lowered his head slightly, tail still, posture respectful. Marilyn looked down at him. Slowly, almost involuntarily, she reached out and rested her fingers against the thick fur at his neck. Rex didn't move. "What's his name?" she asked. "Rex," Ethan said. "He's my partner." "He's gentle," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "He is." For a moment, none of them spoke. Wind swept across the cemetery, lifting fine snow into the air. The world felt narrowed to this small, impossible task, and the people caught inside it. Ethan looked at Marilyn, really looked at her, and knew this moment would stay with him long after his shift ended. He didn't yet know why, only that something had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. "I'm not here to stop you," he said at last. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't alone." Marilyn's jaw tightened. "I am alone," she said. "That's the point." Rex sat back down at her feet anyway. And in the silence that followed, with the frozen earth unbroken and the morning growing colder, Ethan realized this was not a call he could clear, not a report he could file. This was the beginning of something he didn't yet have a name for. The cold deepened as the morning stretched on, the kind of cold that settled into bone and thought alike, making even time feel slower. The sun never fully rose. It only hovered behind a thick veil of cloud, casting the cemetery in a dull, colorless light. Ethan Mercer stood where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, the weight of his badge suddenly heavier than it had been in years. Marilyn Brooks had turned back to the ground, lifting the shovel again with a stubbornness that bordered on defiance. The metal rang sharply as it struck frozen earth, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet valley. Ethan watched for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He had intervened in countless situations, domestic disputes, accidents, deaths, but this was different. There was no threat to neutralize, no scene to secure, only a woman fighting the ground itself, as if sheer will might make it yield. Rex rose smoothly from his seated position and stepped closer to Marilyn, his movements careful, deliberate. He sniffed the air once, then lowered himself beside the coffin again. his body aligned with it, broad back shielding it slightly from the wind. His ears flicked back toward Ethan, waiting for direction, but none came. Marilyn noticed the dog's movement. Her grip on the shovel loosened, just a fraction. "He doesn't have to stay," she said without looking at Ethan. "I don't want him cold." "He's fine," Ethan replied. "He'd let me know if he wasn't." That was true. Rex had worked winters harsher than this, searching avalanche paths, standing alert for hours while humans came and went. At 7, he was no longer young, but his strength was intact, his presence solid and reassuring. His coat was thick, built for mountain weather, and his eyes, dark and intent, missed very little. Marilyn swung the shovel again. It bounced uselessly. Her shoulders sagged, and she leaned forward slightly, breathing hard. Up close, Ethan could see how exhaustion had hollowed her out. She had been a nurse once, he remembered, one of those who moved quickly and spoke calmly even when everything around them was chaos. Now that competence had turned inward, sharpened into something rigid. "This ground isn't going to give," Ethan said gently. "Not today." "I don't have another day," Marilyn replied. Her voice didn't rise, but it trembled with effort. "I can't leave him like this." Ethan inhaled slowly. He reached up and unfastened the clasp at his collar, then shrugged out of his jacket. The black fabric, marked with the Durango police insignia, came off easily. He folded it once and set it carefully on the hood of his SUV. The cold bit immediately through the thinner layer beneath, but he barely noticed. Marilyn turned, startled. "What are you doing?" Ethan met her gaze. "Right now, I'm not a police officer." He unpinned his badge next, the small piece of metal catching what little light there was. He placed it beside the jacket. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, though he hadn't planned it that way. He hadn't set his badge down like this since the day he buried his wife, when he had come home and realized he couldn't stand to look at it. Marilyn stared at him, something uncertain crossing her face. "You don't have to." "I know," Ethan said, "but I want to." He stepped forward and took the shovel from her hands. This time, she didn't resist. Her fingers were stiff, barely curling as she let go, and she rubbed them together absently, as if only just noticing the pain in them. Ethan positioned himself over the patch of ground she'd been working on. He drove the shovel down with controlled force. The blade barely penetrated, but he adjusted, angling it, applying pressure rather than brute strength. The earth resisted stubbornly, but there was a slight give, a thin crack opening where none had been before. It was progress, however small. Rex watched intently, head tilted, ears forward. He shifted closer to Marilyn as she sank down onto a nearby headstone, her legs no longer steady enough to hold her. She rested one gloved hand against Rex's shoulder, drawing comfort from the warmth beneath his fur. "You don't know him," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the coffin. "My son." Ethan kept working. Each movement was precise, economical. Digging like this reminded him of his early days on the force, when he had learned that rushing only led to mistakes. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "Not if you don't want to." Marilyn swallowed. His name was Noah. He was 6. He liked dogs, big ones especially. Said they looked brave. Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, as if he understood the importance of what was being said. Ethan paused, resting his weight briefly on the shovel handle. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were honest. They worked in silence. For a while after that. Time passed strangely, measured not in minutes but in effort. Ethan's breath fogged the air, sweat dampening the back of his neck despite the cold. He managed to break through the top layer of frozen soil, loosening a shallow section. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. The sound of an engine approached, faint at first, then clearer. A pickup truck slowed near the cemetery entrance and stopped. A man climbed out, bundled in a heavy coat, his movements stiff. He was in his late 50s, Ethan guessed, tall but stooped slightly, with a gray beard that spread thick across his jaw and neck. His face was deeply lined, weathered by years outdoors. He wore a knit cap pulled low and work gloves tucked into his belt. "Morning," the man called cautiously. Ethan straightened. "Morning, Tom." Tom Alvarez was a lifelong Durango resident, a retired road maintenance worker known for keeping to himself. He had a reputation for being gruff but reliable, the kind of man who showed up when bridges iced over and left before anyone could thank him. Tom took in the scene, the shovel, the coffin, the woman seated with the dog, and his expression softened. He nodded once. "Figured you might need this." He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a pickaxe. its handle worn smooth from years of use. Ethan accepted it with a quiet nod. Appreciate it. Tom didn't ask questions. He simply joined in, swinging the pick with steady, practiced motions, breaking the earth where Ethan couldn't. They worked in tandem, wordless, each understanding the other's rhythm. Marilyn watched them, disbelief, and something like relief mingling in her eyes. She said nothing, only tightened her hand on Rex's fur. By the time the hole had reached a workable depth, not finished, but finally possible, the sky had shifted, dark clouds gathering heavier overhead. Snow began to fall again, fine and persistent. Ethan stepped back, chest heaving, slightly. His arms ached, muscles burning, but the sight before him felt like a fragile victory. He looked at Marilyn. "We'll finish this," he said. "I promise." She nodded, tears finally spilling over, freezing almost instantly on her lashes. Rex stood and moved closer to her, pressing his side against her legs, grounding her. Ethan glanced once more at his badge resting on the hood of his SUV, then back at the grave taking shape in the frozen earth. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this moment marked a turning point, not just for Marilyn, but for himself as well. This was no longer about duty. It was about staying. Snow continued to fall as if the sky had decided this small hillside deserved its own private storm. The flakes were fine and relentless, settling into collars and hairlines, filling the shallow impressions of footprints almost as soon as they were made. The world narrowed to the cemetery, the half-dug grave, and the quiet labor taking place within it. Ethan Mercer wiped his brow with the back of his glove and adjusted his stance, muscles protesting as he drove the shovel deeper. The earth, once merely resistant, had begun to crack in earnest now, loosened by Tom Alvarez's pickaxe and Ethan's steady persistence. Tom worked without ceremony. He was a solid presence, broad-chested beneath his heavy coat, movements economical, shaped by decades of physical labor. His gray beard was dusted white with snow, and his breath came out in slow, measured clouds. Years ago, a workplace accident had crushed 2 fingers on his left hand, leaving them stiff and slightly bent. Since then, Tom had learned patience the hard way. It showed in the way he worked now, never rushing, never forcing what wouldn't yield. Marilyn Brooks remained seated near the coffin, her back straight, despite the tremor running through her frame. She had pulled her gloves off and tucked them into her coat pockets, pressing her bare hands into Rex's thick fur instead. The dog stayed pressed against her leg, his weight solid and reassuring. Rex's dark eyes followed every movement Ethan made, alert but calm, as if committing the moment to memory. His tail lay still against the snow, but his posture spoke of quiet vigilance. Ethan paused when the shovel struck something different. Softer, workable soil beneath the frozen crust. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're getting there," he said, keeping his voice low. Marilyn nodded, though she didn't look up. "Thank you," she said. The words were barely audible, but they carried more weight than any formal acknowledgement ever had. Tom stepped back and leaned on the handle of the pickaxe. "Depth's good enough now," he said, voice roughened by cold and age. "Not perfect, but it'll do." Ethan met his gaze and nodded. They both knew there would be time later to make it right, to deepen and square the grave properly. For now, what mattered was that the impossible had become possible. A gust of wind swept across the cemetery, bending the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the edge of the grounds. The sound it made, a low, hollow moan, sent a shiver through Marilyn. She drew her coat tighter around herself. Ethan set the shovel aside and reached into his jacket pocket, the one folded on the hood of his SUV. His fingers closed around a small, worn book. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "My father carried this," he said quietly, holding it out slightly so Marilyn could see. "I should keep it with me, not on duty, just in case." The Bible's leather cover was cracked with age, the edges softened by years of use. Ethan's hands were large, steady, though his grip tightened briefly before he opened it. Marilyn looked up then, really looked at him. Up close, she could see the strain etched into his face, the way the cold had reddened his skin, the faint scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before. He looked like a man who had stood beside grief often enough to recognize it without being told. "If you don't want this," Ethan said, "I'll understand." Marilyn swallowed. "No," she said after a moment. "Please." Tom removed his knit cap and held it against his chest. He didn't bow his head, exactly, but his gaze dropped to the ground, respectful in his own quiet way. Rex rose smoothly to his feet, standing close to Marilyn's side, his head level, ears forward. Ethan read slowly, choosing passages that spoke not of endings, but of care, of being gathered, of rest. His voice was calm, practiced in speaking under pressure, yet softened by something more personal. The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, but they were the best he had. Marilyn's shoulders began to shake halfway through. At first, she fought it, pressing her lips together, forcing herself to remain still. Then the restraint broke. A sob tore free, sharp and raw, followed by another. She leaned forward, folding into herself, and Rex immediately adjusted, bracing his body so she could grip his fur without losing balance. He did not whine or move away, he simply stayed. When Ethan finished, he closed the book gently. Silence followed, heavy but not empty. Snow continued to fall, indifferent to human sorrow. Together, Ethan and Tom moved to lower the coffin. It was lighter than either expected. That, Ethan realized dimly, was its own kind of cruelty. Marilyn rose unsteadily, one hand resting on Rex's back, and stepped forward. "I need to do this," she said. Ethan stepped aside without question. Marilyn knelt at the edge of the grave. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were afraid that one wrong motion might shatter what little composure she had left. She guided the coffin down, her arms trembling under its slight weight. When it settled into the earth with a muted sound, she froze, hands still resting on the lid. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, she spoke Noah's name. Rex sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. His breathing was slow, steady, a quiet anchor in the storm of grief. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, something he'd learned to lock away years ago. He turned his gaze to the horizon instead, giving Marilyn the privacy she deserved. When she finally stood, her legs nearly gave way. Ethan moved forward instinctively, but she steadied herself, drawing strength from Rex instead. They filled the grave together, carefully, respectfully. Tom found 2 straight branches near the edge of the cemetery and lashed them into a simple cross using a length of cord from his truck. He worked with surprising delicacy for a man of his size, fingers deft despite the cold. "That'll hold," he said, planting it firmly at the head of the grave. "At least till spring." Marilyn nodded. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now, though her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. The sky darkened further, afternoon slipping toward evening. The cold intensified, the promise of worse weather to come hanging heavy in the air. Tom pulled his coat tighter. "I should head back before the roads get worse," he said, already stepping away. He hesitated, then added, "You're not alone out here." Marilyn watched him go, then turned to Ethan. "I live just over the ridge," she said. "About a mile." Ethan followed her gaze. The road would be treacherous soon. He glanced at Rex, who was already alert, watching Marilyn as if the decision had been made. "I'll walk you home," Ethan said, "just to make sure you get there." Marilyn studied him for a moment, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found there, it seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once. Rex moved to her side immediately, as if assuming his new post. As they left the cemetery behind, snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Ethan glanced back once, at the fresh mound of earth and the simple cross standing against the gray sky. He knew this place would never be just another point on his patrol route again. Rex did not look back at all. The snow thickened as they left the cemetery, falling in wide, unhurried flakes that blurred the edges of the world. The path leading away from the hillside was barely visible now, a pale suggestion beneath fresh accumulation. Marilyn Brooks walked carefully, her boots sinking into the drifts with each step, while Ethan Mercer matched his pace to hers without comment. He kept to her left, close enough to intervene if she stumbled, but far enough to give her space. Years in uniform had taught him how to escort someone without making them feel escorted. Rex moved ahead of them, alert and purposeful, his dark shape cutting a narrow trail through the snow. At 7 years old, the German Shepherd no longer had the reckless energy of youth, but what he lacked in speed, he made up for in judgment. He paused often, glancing back to make sure Marilyn was still behind him, then continued forward with quiet determination. His coat was dusted white now, snow clinging to the longer fur along his chest and tail. The wind picked up as they crested the ridge, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. Below them, the valley stretched out, muted and gray, the outlines of scattered homes barely discernible through the snowfall. Marilyn's cabin sat near the edge of a stand of trees, tucked close to the hillside, as if seeking shelter there. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a thin thread against the sky. "I left the stove going," Marilyn said, as if explaining herself. Her voice sounded distant, worn thin. Didn't want to come back to a cold house. That was smart, Ethan replied. With this weather. They continued in silence. Ethan was acutely aware of how the cold was affecting her. Her shoulders were tense, her movements slower now, fatigue catching up with adrenaline. He'd seen it many times before, people holding themselves together until the immediate task was done, then unraveling piece by piece. When they reached the cabin, Rex stopped at the door and waited, sitting back on his haunches. The structure itself was modest, a single-story log cabin with a low roof and a small porch half buried in snow. The wood was weathered but well-maintained, the windows shuttered against the cold. It was the kind of place someone built to last, not to impress. Marilyn fumbled briefly with the key before managing to unlock the door. Warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of burning pine and something faintly medicinal. Leftover antiseptic, Ethan guessed. A remnant of her former life in hospitals. She stepped inside, then paused, glancing back at Rex. "You can come in," she said softly, though she hadn't been speaking to Ethan. Rex didn't hesitate. He crossed the threshold and immediately lay down near the stove, positioning himself so that he could see both Marilyn and the door. Snow melted from his fur, pooling on the wooden floor. Ethan remained outside for a moment longer, scanning the surroundings out of habit. The snowfall was intensifying, visibility dropping fast. He made a decision he'd already known was coming. "I'm going to stay a bit," he said as he stepped inside. "Just until I know you're settled." Marilyn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The interior of the cabin was simple but orderly. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, shelves lined with neatly stacked jars and tins. A narrow table stood near the window, 2 chairs pushed in close. Against the far wall was a couch covered with a heavy quilt, and beside it, a bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks and medical texts. A child's drawing was pinned above the shelf, crayon lines forming a lopsided dog and a stick figure boy beneath a bright yellow sun. Ethan noticed it immediately and then deliberately looked away. Marilyn removed her coat slowly, as if each motion required conscious effort, and hung it by the door. Her hands shook as she poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove. "Tea?" she asked, defaulting to the habits of care she knew so well. "That'd be good," Ethan said. He took off his boots and stood awkwardly near the door, unsure where to put himself. He was used to other people's homes only in moments of crisis, when permission was implied. This felt different, more intimate, more uncertain. The kettle began to whistle softly. Marilyn poured the water, her movements precise despite her exhaustion, and handed Ethan a chipped mug. Their fingers brushed briefly. She flinched, then seemed embarrassed by it. "Sorry," she said. "I'm just tired." "I know," Ethan replied. They stood in silence, steam rising between them. Rex lifted his head briefly, then settled again, eyes half-lidded but alert. A sudden gust rattled the windows, followed by the distant sound of wind rising through the trees. Ethan's radio crackled at his hip, dispatch checking in, voices distorted by interference. He listened, then responded briefly, keeping his tone professional. When he clipped the radio back onto his belt, he exhaled slowly. "They're closing some of the roads," he said. "Storm's moving faster than expected." Marilyn's grip tightened on her mug. "Does that mean—" "It means I shouldn't leave just yet," Ethan said. "Not safely." She nodded again, this time more firmly. "You can stay. There's room by the fire." He considered refusing, instinct urging him toward distance, propriety. Then another gust shook the cabin, and he remembered the look on her face at the graveside, the way Rex had anchored her when she couldn't stand on her own. "All right," he said. They moved around each other carefully, a quiet choreography born of mutual respect. Ethan added wood to the stove, his movements practiced, while Marilyn sat at the table, shoulders slumping now that she'd allowed herself to stop moving. Rex shifted positions to lie closer to her feet. After a while, Marilyn spoke again, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "He used to hate storms." Ethan looked up. "Noah?" She nodded. "He'd crawl into my bed when the wind got loud, said it sounded like the mountains were angry." Ethan smiled faintly. "They do that sometimes." She looked at him then, really looked, as if noticing the lines of his face for the first time, the faint crease between his brows, the scar along his jaw, the way weariness and restraint sat equally in his posture. "You've seen a lot," she said. He didn't deny it. Enough. Outside, the storm closed in, sealing the cabin off from the rest of the world. Snow piled against the door, wind howling now with real force. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting warm light across the room, across the three of them bound together by circumstance and something quieter, deeper. Ethan sat back in the chair near the hearth, boots drying, jacket folded beside him. Rex let out a slow breath and rested his head on his paws. Marilyn stared into her mug, the steam fogging her vision, and for the first time since the cemetery, she allowed herself to feel something other than loss. Not relief, not yet, but safety. By nightfall, the storm had settled fully into its purpose. Snow drove sideways against the cabin walls, piling high enough to swallow the bottom half of the windows. The wind howled through the trees with a ferocity that felt personal, as if the mountains themselves were intent on reminding anyone listening how small they were. Inside, the cabin creaked and groaned, old logs shifting under pressure, but it held. It had been built by hands that understood winters like this. Ethan Mercer stood near the window for a long moment, watching the white blur beyond the glass. Years of patrol work had trained him to read danger quickly, to decide when movement was possible, and when staying put was the only reasonable option. Tonight offered no ambiguity. The roads would be gone by now, erased beneath drifting snow. Even if he could reach his vehicle, driving out would be reckless at best. Behind him, Marilyn Brooks moved quietly through the cabin, her steps soft, almost cautious, as if sound itself might shatter something fragile. She had changed into dry clothes, thick wool pants and an oversized sweater that hung loosely from her narrow shoulders. Her hair, freed from its hat, fell in dark waves down her back, slightly tangled, catching the firelight. Without the rigid armor she'd worn at the cemetery, she looked younger, and somehow more worn at the same time. Rex lay stretched out between the stove and the couch, his body positioned with deliberate care. His ears twitched at every change in sound, but his breathing remained slow and even. The heat from the fire had dried most of the snow from his coat, leaving it fluffed and thick, the black saddle along his back glossy in the low light. At 7 years old, Rex carried himself with the confidence of a veteran who had seen enough danger to know when vigilance mattered and when rest was permitted. Marilyn set a pot of soup on the stove, the simple act grounding her. "It won't be fancy," she said, her voice steady but subdued. "Just something warm." "That's perfect," Ethan replied. He moved away from the window and took a seat in the chair near the hearth, setting his radio aside. For once there was nothing he could respond to, no call he could answer. The storm had cut them off completely. As the soup warmed, the cabin filled with the scent of broth and herbs. It was faint but comforting, a reminder of ordinary life continuing even in extraordinary circumstances. Marilyn ladled the soup into 2 bowls and placed them on the table, hands steady now, though her eyes remained distant. They ate quietly. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say yet. Outside, the wind battered the cabin relentlessly, each gust punctuating the space between them. After a while, Marilyn set her spoon down. "He would have liked this," she said softly. Ethan didn't ask who she meant. "Yeah," he said instead. "He always said soup was what you ate when things went wrong," she continued. "Said it made problems smaller." Ethan smiled faintly. "Smart kid." Her lips curved just slightly at that, then fell again. She pushed her chair back and stood, moving to the window. She wiped a small circle clear in the fogged glass and stared out into the storm. "I keep thinking I hear him," she said, "running down the hall, laughing." Ethan watched her carefully. He recognized the look, the mind replaying memories unbidden, refusing to accept the new shape of the world. "That doesn't go away quickly," he said. "Sometimes it doesn't go away at all." She turned to look at him then, her expression sharp. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" He met her gaze without flinching. "It's supposed to be honest." Something in his tone seemed to disarm her. She nodded once and returned to the table, sitting more heavily this time. Rex lifted his head and shifted closer, resting his chin against her knee. She absently ran her fingers through the fur at his neck, grounding herself in the warmth and solidity of him. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. The storm raged on, hour after hour, unrelenting. Eventually, the soup bowls were cleared away, the cabin settling into a quieter rhythm. Ethan unrolled a blanket near the hearth, laying it out with methodical precision. "I'll sleep here," he said. "I'm used to it." Marilyn hesitated. "There's a bed," she said, then stopped herself. I mean, it's fine, he said quickly. Really? She nodded, grateful, though something unspoken lingered between them. She dimmed the lamp and moved toward the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, pausing in the doorway. If you need anything, she said. I'm good, Ethan replied. The night stretched long. The wind never fully died, and the cabin seemed to breathe with it, expanding and contracting under the strain. Ethan lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm, and to the subtle sounds of Marilyn moving restlessly in the other room. Rex shifted occasionally, adjusting his position, always keeping one ear tuned toward the bedroom. Sometime past midnight, a sound cut through the wind, a sharp, broken sob. Ethan sat up immediately, heart pounding. He waited a moment, unsure, then heard it again, unmistakable this time. Grief raw and unrestrained. He stood and moved quietly toward the bedroom door, stopping just short. Marilyn, he called softly. It's Ethan. There was no immediate response, only the sound of uneven breathing. Rex rose and followed, standing beside Ethan, his posture alert but gentle. After a moment, Marilyn spoke, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You don't have to apologize, Ethan said. He pushed the door open slowly. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow from the hearth. Marilyn sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around herself, shoulders shaking. Ethan stayed where he was, giving her space. Do you want me to leave? He asked. She shook her head. No, just don't try to fix it. I won't, he promised. He sat on the floor a few feet away, leaning back against the wall. Rex lay down between them, forming a quiet bridge of warmth and presence. For a long time, Marilyn said nothing. Then, haltingly, the words came. She talked about the night Noah's fever spiked, about the way she'd checked his breathing over and over, counting seconds like it might make a difference. She spoke of the ambulance ride, the hospital lights too bright, the moment she knew before anyone told her. Her voice broke repeatedly, but she kept going, as if afraid that stopping would mean losing him all over again. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He'd learned long ago that grief needed witnesses, not solutions. When she finally fell silent, spent and hollowed, out, he spoke quietly. My wife died on a mountain road, he said. Black ice. I was on duty. Didn't get there in time. Marilyn looked at him, eyes red and searching. I spent years thinking if I'd done something differently, she'd still be here, he continued. That kind of thinking will eat you alive if you let it. She nodded slowly, understanding in her bones. They sat there until the storm began to ease, the wind dropping from a roar to a steady moan. When Marilyn's breathing finally evened out, Ethan rose carefully and returned to his place by the hearth. Rex followed, but not before glancing back at Marilyn one last time, ensuring she was calm. As Ethan lay down again, exhaustion finally overtaking him, he understood something with startling clarity. This night had changed the shape of things. Not resolved them, not healed them, but shifted them, just enough to let something new exist alongside the pain. Outside, the storm began to loosen its grip. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm did not end so much as retreat, its fury easing into a gray stillness that felt almost fragile. Snow lay heaped against the cabin door, packed hard by wind, and the world beyond the window looked newly made, quiet, smoothed over, deceptively calm. Ethan Mercer woke before the light changed, habit pulling him from sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin no longer groaned. The wind had dropped to a low whisper. Somewhere in the back room, Marilyn Brooks slept, her breathing finally even. Rex stirred first. The German shepherd rose with a stretch that rolled through his shoulders and spine, then padded to the door, nose pressed briefly to the seam where cold air leaked in. His ears flicked, satisfied, he turned back to Ethan, tail giving a single, restrained wag. 7 years of work had taught him when urgency was required and when patience served better. Ethan eased up from the blanket by the hearth and added a log to the stove, careful to keep the noise down. The fire caught, warmth blooming outward. He washed his face at the sink, the cold water biting awake the last of the night. When he glanced at his reflection in the small mirror above the basin, he saw a man older than he remembered. Eyes rimmed with fatigue, jaw set a little too tight. The night had shifted something in him, and he didn't yet know how to carry it. Marilyn emerged quietly, wrapped in a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She looked exhausted but steadier, as if grief had spent itself for now, and left behind a fragile calm. They exchanged a look, acknowledgement without words. "I'll clear the door," Ethan said. "Roads might open later." She nodded. "I'll make coffee." They worked side by side without touching, an easy coordination that felt earned rather than accidental. Outside, Ethan shoveled a narrow path, snow scraping and thudding in rhythmic effort. The air was sharp, bright with cold, and the silence carried far. A raven crossed the sky, black against white. By mid-morning, the path was passable. Ethan returned inside, steam rising from his coat. Marilyn poured coffee into 2 mugs. They stood by the window, watching sunlight struggle through the clouds. "I should head back," Ethan said. "Check in. Make sure everyone's accounted for." Marilyn's fingers tightened briefly around her mug. "Of course." He hesitated. "I can come by later, if you need anything." She looked at him, then down. "I'll be all right." Rex rose at the word go, posture alert. He followed Ethan to the door, then paused, glancing back at Marilyn. She knelt and rested her forehead against his, breathing him in, steadying herself. "Go on," she murmured. Rex returned to Ethan's side. The drive into town was slow. Snowbanks narrowed the roads, and plows had only begun their work. At the station, the lights were on, the familiar hum of routine resuming. Deputy Aaron Pike stood by, the front desk, shoulders hunched inside his uniform. A man in his early 30s with a close-cropped beard and eyes that missed very little. Pike had grown up here, lost his father to a logging accident at 16, and had learned early that order could be a kind of mercy. "You look like hell," Pike said by way of greeting. "Storm?" Ethan replied. "Everyone okay?" Pike nodded. "No casualties, few stranded. We managed." As Ethan signed reports, he felt the weight of eyes on him. It wasn't hostility, more curiosity edged with judgment. In a town this size, kindness traveled fast, but so did conclusions. At the general store later, as he picked up supplies, the air shifted again. Mrs. Helen Crow stood near the counter, a woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a neat bun, posture upright despite the years. She had run the store for decades after her husband's heart attack took him too young. Her gaze lingered on Ethan longer than necessary. "Morning, Officer Mercer," she said, voice polite, precise. "Rough night." "Morning," Ethan said evenly. "People were worried," she continued, eyes flicking to Rex. "Heard you stayed out by the ridge, with the Brooks woman." The words were measured, but the implication wasn't. Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs. "Storm made it unsafe to leave," he said. "Did my job." Mrs. Crow nodded slowly. "Of course." The pause that followed said otherwise. Outside, a pair of men stood talking near the pumps. Cal Whitaker and Jonas Reed, both ranch hands, both bearded, weather-worn. Men who spoke plainly and remembered everything. Their conversation dipped as Ethan passed, then resumed in lower tones. By afternoon, the road to Marilyn's cabin had reopened enough for travel. Ethan considered stopping by. He didn't. Instead, he drove home, fed Rex, and sat at his kitchen table long after the coffee went cold. The night replayed itself in fragments. Marilyn's voice in the dark, the way Rex had bridged the space between them, the promise he had made simply by staying. The next day, he stayed away. One day became 3, then 5. He told himself it was professionalism, respect, the right thing. He threw himself into work, into small repairs around the house, into running Rex along the river trail until the dog's tongue lolled and his breath came hard. But Rex noticed the absence. He sat by the door in the evenings, ears pricked at every passing sound, and ate less than usual. When Ethan reached for the leash to head toward the ridge, Rex surged with hope. When they turned the other way, he whined once, low and confused. At the station, Pike watched him carefully. "You all right?" he asked one evening, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed. "I'm fine," Ethan said. Pike didn't press. He knew better than to push a man who was already wrestling himself. A week later, Ethan drove past the turnoff to Marilyn's place and didn't slow. The choice felt deliberate, heavy. He told himself he was protecting her, from gossip, from misunderstanding, from a kindness that could be mistaken for something else. He told himself restraint was a virtue. That night, as he lay awake, he understood the lie inside it. He wasn't staying away to protect her. He was staying away to protect himself, from wanting something he wasn't sure he deserved, from needing someone when he had learned to live without needing at all. Rex stood and paced, nails clicking softly on the floor, then settled again near the door, eyes on Ethan. The dog had no patience for abstractions. He understood presence and absence, loyalty and its breach. By the end of the week, the silence had settled in fully, between Ethan and Marilyn, between Ethan and his own certainty. The storm had passed, the town had returned to itself, and yet something essential remained suspended, waiting for a decision neither weather nor time could make. The morning broke clear and brittle, sunlight flashing hard off the snow as if the world were made of glass. The storm's debris lay everywhere, banked drifts along fences, frozen ridges where plows had passed, the river locked into slow, dark plates. Ethan Mercer rose before dawn, pulled on his jacket, and clipped Rex's leash with the familiar snap that usually settled the dog into working calm. Today, it didn't. Rex was restless from the start. He paced while Ethan brewed coffee, nails clicking sharply against the floor, ears flicking toward the door with a frequency that felt urgent rather than alert. At 7, Rex knew routines, knew when a morning meant patrol and when it meant rest. This morning, he knew something else. When Ethan reached for the leash, Rex surged forward, then stopped short, turning his head not toward the truck, but toward the road that led out of town, toward the ridge. "Not today," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. He tugged gently, redirecting. Rex resisted, only a second, but it was enough to register as defiance. His dark eyes held Ethan's, intent, pleading in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. They stepped outside anyway. The air was sharp, clean. A magpie hopped along the fence line, head cocked. Ethan closed the door behind them, locked it, and turned toward the truck. Rex planted his feet and let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, something in between. Ethan exhaled. "All right," he said, loosening his grip. "All right." They drove, not toward the station, not toward the river trail, but out of town, tires crunching over hardpack, the truck's engine a steady hum beneath the quiet. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, nose lifted, eyes fixed ahead. He had done this before, broken pattern to save time, to save lives. The last time had been 3 winters ago, when he'd pulled Ethan off a trail and led him straight to a lost hiker buried under drift. Protocol had followed instinct, then not the other way around. They reached the turnoff to the ridge as the sun climbed. Ethan slowed, heart thudding with a certainty he hadn't allowed himself all week. The cabin was still there, smoke absent now, the yard smoothed by wind. But the path toward the lake, an oval of dark ice tucked below the slope, was scarred with fresh tracks. Ethan stopped as the truck and grabbed his jacket. "Rex," he said, clipped the leash, then hesitated. He unclipped it again. Rex bolted. He ran with the economy of a seasoned canine, no wasted motion, head low, paws striking true. Ethan followed, boots slipping once on glare ice, then catching. The lake came into view, its surface a deceptive mirror under the sun. Near the far edge, a figure lay sprawled, one arm splayed awkwardly, the other clutching at snow. "Marilyn!" Ethan shouted, breath tearing from his chest. She was conscious, barely. Marilyn Brooks lay half on the ice, half on the bank, her face pale, lips bloodless, hair plastered damply to her cheek. One boot had slid free, sock soaked through. A thin spiderweb of cracks radiated from beneath her hip where the ice had given way. Rex reached her first. He circled once, assessing, then lowered himself, bracing his weight on solid ground. Marilyn's fingers were numb, clumsy, but she found the thick ruff at his neck and clung. Rex shifted, anchoring her, his body a barrier between her and the widening crack. He did not move again. Ethan skidded to a stop and dropped to his knees. "Don't try to stand," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He scanned quickly. No obvious fractures, but the cold had teeth. "I've got you." "I slipped," Marilyn whispered. "I was just checking the nets. I thought the ice was thicker." "It happens," Ethan said. He eased his jacket off and draped it over her shoulders, then pulled his radio free. The signal crackled, unreliable but present. He gave coordinates, clipped instructions. Help would come, but time mattered now. Ethan slid onto the ice on his stomach, distributing his weight, inching closer. Rex stayed locked, muscles trembling with controlled effort. Marilyn's eyes fluttered. Ethan reached for her free arm, guiding it across Rex's shoulders, then wrapped his own around her back. "On 3, he said. 1, 2. The ice groaned. Ethan didn't wait for 3. He pulled, rolling them together onto the bank. The ice fractured behind them with a sharp report, water seeping up, black and hungry. They lay there for a moment, breathing hard. Rex rose immediately, shaking snow from his coat, then pressed his body against Marilyn's side, warmth deliberate. Ethan pulled her closer, feeling the violent shiver rack her frame. "Why did you come?" Marilyn asked faintly, eyes finding his. Ethan swallowed. "Because I shouldn't have stayed away." She closed her eyes, a tear freezing at the corner. "I don't need to be rescued," she said. The words brittle but clear. "I need to be chosen." The truth landed with the weight of inevitability. Ethan had known it for days, circling it with caution, mistaking restraint for virtue. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers, breath mingling in the cold. "I choose you," he said, "not because you're alone, because you're you." Footsteps crunched. Deputy Aaron Pike appeared first, moving fast, beard rimed with frost, followed by a tall woman in a heavy parka with a medical kit slung crossbody. Dr. Lena Morris was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, hair cropped short for practicality. She knelt immediately, efficient and calm, fingers checking pulse, skin temperature. "She's hypothermic," Morris said. "Mild to moderate. We'll warm her gradually." Pike glanced at the cracked ice, then at Rex, admiration flickering. "Good dog," he said quietly. They moved Marilyn carefully, wrapping her in blankets, easing her into the back of the truck. Rex jumped up, without prompting, and lay beside her, head on her thigh, eyes never leaving her face. She curled her fingers into his fur. At the clinic later, under warm lights and the quiet hum of machines, Marilyn's color returned. Dr. Morris explained protocols, cautions, timelines. Ethan listened, nodded, signed where needed. When they were finally alone, Marilyn looked at him with a steadiness that felt new. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I will," he replied, "as long as you'll have me." Outside, Rex sat at the window, posture easy at last, the crisis resolved. He had broken protocol again, ignored command, followed instinct. And again, it had mattered. As the sun dipped, painting the snow with gold, Ethan understood that some lines existed to be crossed, not recklessly, purposefully, for the right reason. Spring arrived quietly in Durango, as if unsure whether it would be welcomed after such a hard winter. The snow did not vanish all at once. It thinned, retreated in patches, revealing dark earth beneath, damp and newly alive. The river loosened its grip, ice breaking apart with soft, echoing cracks, and the mountains softened at their edges, trading sharp whites for browns and greens. The town stirred differently now, doors left open longer, conversations lingering in the sunlight. Ethan Mercer noticed the change in himself before he noticed it in the world. He woke earlier, not from habit or duty, but from a sense of purpose that no longer felt borrowed. The weeks after the accident at the lake passed slowly, deliberately. Marilyn Brooks recovered steadily, her strength returning in small, meaningful ways. Longer walks, steadier hands, laughter that surprised them both when it came. Ethan did not retreat again. This time, staying felt honest. Rex changed too. The German shepherd still carried the discipline of a canine, but the edge of vigilance had softened. At 7, nearing the end of his official service, he moved with an ease that suggested he finally understood he was home. His coat gleamed in the sun, the gray along his muzzle more noticeable now, giving him a dignified air. He slept often, stretched out on porches and clinic floors alike, but rose instantly whenever Marilyn's footsteps sounded. They fell into a rhythm without naming it. Ethan repaired the broken fence near Marilyn's cabin, his movements methodical, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by old scars, one from barbed wire during a pursuit years ago, another from shattered glass the night Laura died. Marilyn tended her small garden plot, turning soil that had been frozen solid months before, planting early greens with care. Rex lay nearby, tracking their movements with lazy attention. One afternoon, as the air warmed enough to shed coats, Marilyn paused in the garden, leaning on her spade. "Will you come with me?" she asked. Ethan knew where she meant. He nodded. The path to the cemetery was different now. Grass pushed through in stubborn clumps, wildflowers beginning to dot the hillside. The cottonwood at the edge had budded, branches tipped with green. Noah's grave had settled, the earth smoothed by time and weather. The wooden cross Tom Alvarez had fashioned still stood, weathered but firm. Marilyn knelt, pressing her palm to the ground. She spoke quietly, telling her son about the winter ending, about Rex, the dog who wouldn't leave, and about Ethan, standing a respectful distance back, hat in his hands. When she finished, she looked up, eyes clear. "I'm ready," she said simply. Ethan stepped forward. He didn't rush. He took her hands, felt their warmth, their strength. "So am I," he said. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. Ethan Mercer had never been a man of flourishes. He spoke plainly, as he always had. "I can't promise an easy life," he said, "but I can promise I won't walk away. Not from you, not from what we build." Marilyn smiled then, a full smile, unguarded. "That's all I need." They married in late May, when the hills around Durango were fully green and the air carried the scent of pine and thawed earth. The ceremony was small, held in the open yard behind Ethan's house. Deputy Aaron Pike stood off to one side, arms crossed, grin barely concealed beneath his beard. Tom Alvarez arrived early and left quietly, content to have helped in his own way. Mrs. Helen Crow attended too, her expression reserved but sincere, offering a nod that carried something like approval. Marilyn wore a simple dress she'd altered herself, pale blue, practical and elegant. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands catching the light. Ethan wore his uniform jacket, but left the badge pinned inside, unseen. When he took her hands, his grip was steady, though his breath hitched, once. Rex lay between them, a blue bandana tied loosely around his neck. He watched with solemn attention, tail thumping once when the vows were spoken, as if sealing them. They did not pretend the past was gone. Noah's name was spoken, Laura's was too. Grief did not vanish, it settled, found its place. That was the quiet miracle of spring. It did not erase winter, but it proved it could be survived. Later, as evening softened into gold, Marilyn played music softly from an old radio, and Rex dozed at their feet. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, watching his wife laugh with neighbors, sunlight in her hair, life unmistakably present. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man defined by what he had lost. He felt chosen. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way we expect. He doesn't always part the storm or bring back what we have lost. Sometimes he sends a person who stops when the world keeps moving. Sometimes he sends a loyal animal who refuses to leave. And sometimes he gives us just enough courage to stay when walking away would be easier. This story is not about forgetting grief. It is about learning that love can stand beside it. That even in the coldest seasons of our lives, God is still working quietly, through kindness, through timing, through second chances we never planned for. If you are watching this today and carrying loss, fear, or loneliness, know this: you are not forgotten. You are not walking alone, and the miracle you need may already be closer than you think. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We would love to pray for you. And if you believe that God still works through quiet acts of love, consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal and remind us we are seen. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to your home. May He watch over every child, every animal, and every weary heart listening right now. And may you find comfort in knowing that even after winter, spring still comes. Amen.